A female FBI agent inherited a ruined lakeside chapel everyone laughed at, but her German shepherd froze before the pulpit, trembling at a scent no human could explain. Beneath the old hymns, something priceless was waiting in the dark. One iron key opened a secret the wealthy tried to bury forever. If you believe God still guides the loyal and reveals truth in forgotten places, leave amen. Special Agent Clara Whitmore arrived at the law office in Burlington, Vermont, just as the morning sun broke over Lake Champlain and turned the glass towers along the street into pale gold. She was 30 years old, with chestnut brown hair tied low at the back of her neck, gray-blue eyes that noticed more than they revealed, and the still posture of someone who had learned to hide grief behind discipline. Her dark FBI coat was plain, her boots practical, her expression calm enough to fool strangers. But beneath that calm lived an old ache, the kind that had followed her since her father's name had been quietly ruined in the art restoration world. At her left side walked Atlas, her 5-year-old German shepherd K9. He had a dark sable coat brushed with gray and gold, broad shoulders, alert ears, and thoughtful brown eyes that seemed too ancient for a dog who still occasionally tried to steal toast from Clara's breakfast plate. Atlas was trained to detect currency, hidden documents, packing materials, chemical preservatives, and concealed compartments. But Clara had long believed there was something more in him, something no academy could teach. Atlas had a way of pausing before closed doors, old trunks, and silent rooms, as if the world whispered through his nose and bones. The office of Harrington and Vale Probate Law sat on the 7th floor, all polished walnut, white orchids, and expensive silence. At the head of the conference table waited Attorney Samuel Harrington, a narrow man in his late 60s with silver hair parted so sharply it looked measured with a ruler. His face was long, clean-shaven, and tired in the way of men who had spent their lives reading the last wishes of the rich and rarely liking what they found. He gave Clara a polite nod, then glanced at Atlas with the uneasy respect people gave a badge, a dog, or a thundercloud. Across the table sat Lydia Vale, Everett Vale's niece. Lydia was a tall woman in her early 50s, elegant as a marble statue and nearly as warm. Her pale blonde hair was swept into a smooth twist, her cream suit fit like it had been sewn around her pride, and a strand of pearls rested at her throat. Lydia spoke softly to everyone, but her eyes remained cold, always weighing, always pricing. Beside her sat Marcus Bellamy, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with silver hair, a square jaw, and a neatly trimmed gray beard. Marcus wore a navy suit and a museum director's smile. He had the polished charm of a man who could praise a sacred statue in public and bargain over it in private. A few distant relatives filled the remaining chairs, murmuring like well-dressed crows around a bright object. Clara did not belong among them, and that was no accident. Everett Vale had made sure she knew it years ago. He had been a collector, a donor, a patron of galleries, and a man whose fortune smelled faintly of old paper, locked rooms, and questions no one at dinner wanted to ask. To Clara he was also the name attached to her father's fall. Her father, Daniel Whitmore, had restored church woodwork, stained glass, and old stone with hands that treated broken things gently. Then came the disputed artifact, the unsigned report, the accusation that he had mishandled a priceless piece. He never recovered his reputation. Clara had come to the reading of Everett's will expecting nothing. She wanted only to hear the last page turn. Attorney Harrington cleared his throat and began. Everett's Manhattan apartment went to Lydia, along with his jewelry collection and control of the Vale Arts Foundation. Lydia lowered her eyes, but the corner of her mouth lifted. Marcus received operational authority over Vale Private Storage, a discreet art warehouse network with climate-controlled rooms and clients who preferred not to appear in brochures. Several cousins received cash, shares, lake property, and things that could be sold before supper if the mood struck. Then Harrington paused. Clara felt the room look at her before he said her name. To Special Agent Clara Ann Whitmore, he read, voice dry as old parchment. Daughter of Daniel Whitmore, who once believed that old walls deserved the truth more than rich men deserved comfort. I leave St. Alder Chapel in Briarhaven, Vermont, together with the land upon which it stands. Lydia's smile widened. Harrington continued. The property includes all attached obligations, unpaid county taxes, pending structural notices, roof repairs, and any municipal penalties related to deferred maintenance. A cousin gave a tiny laugh into her hand. Marcus leaned back, his beard hiding most of his amusement, but not all of it. Harrington slid a folder toward Clara. The town has marked the chapel as unsafe. There are 7 years of unpaid taxes. The roof is unstable. The flooring is compromised. If the debt is not addressed, the property may be seized. Lydia sighed, sweet as poisoned honey. How sentimental of Uncle Everett. A chapel for a woman who chases ghosts. Marcus chuckled. At least it has atmosphere. Clara said nothing. Her face remained still, though heat rose behind her ribs. The room wanted her anger. It wanted her shame. It wanted the pleasure of watching the FBI agent receive a ruin and pretend it did not matter. A sharp metallic clink cut through the laughter. The iron key had slipped from Harrington's folder and struck the table, spinning once in the sunlight before falling still. Atlas stood at once. The room went quiet. His ears lifted, his nose lowered, and he stepped toward the key with slow, deliberate care, as if the little piece of iron had carried a scent across 100 winters. Clara looked down at him. Atlas did not bark. He did not paw. He simply touched his nose to the key and released a low, trembling whine that made the hair at the back of Clara's neck rise. It was not fear. It was recognition. Harrington frowned. That key was included with the chapel deed, likely old, perhaps ceremonial. The front door key is separate. Lydia gave a thin laugh. Even the dog is disappointed. But Clara knew Atlas. She knew the difference between curiosity and a command from some deep animal certainty. She reached for the key. It was heavier than it looked, dark iron with an old-fashioned cut and a worn bow shaped almost like a shepherd's crook. For one brief second, Clara thought of her father standing in a cold church, holding a chisel, telling her that old buildings kept secrets because people did. "I'll accept the property," Clara said. That wiped some of the brightness from Lydia's face. Clara signed the preliminary acceptance papers, then opened her phone and made a brief internal note. Inherited property connected to Everett Vale. Potential conflict if criminal evidence emerges. Notify supervisor immediately upon discovery of suspicious material. Procedure steadied her. It gave her grief a railing to hold. By noon, she was driving east toward Briarhaven with Atlas in the back seat and the strange key wrapped in a handkerchief on the console. Vermont unfolded around them in a wide, shining calm. Birch trees flashed white between the pines. Red maple leaves moved in the wind like small lanterns. Farm stands sold apples, cider donuts, and pumpkins with painted smiles. The farther Clara drove from Burlington, the more the world seemed to soften, as though the mountains were asking her to breathe before they showed her what waited. Briarhaven sat beside St. Alder Lake, a bright northern town with clapboard houses, blue shutters, a tiny post office, and a bakery whose windows glowed with cinnamon warmth. People turned to watch the FBI vehicle pass, not with suspicion, but with the honest curiosity of a town where even a new haircut could become afternoon news. St. Alder Chapel stood beyond the last row of houses, half hidden by tall grass and yellowing reeds near the lake. Once it must have been lovely. Now white paint peeled from the walls in long, tired strips. The roof sagged near the bell tower. Several stained glass panes were cracked, leaving empty spaces where colored saints and shepherds had once caught the morning light. The front doors were heavy oak, swollen by years of weather. Clara unlocked the entrance and pushed. The door groaned open. Inside, dust floated in the sunbeams like tiny lost prayers. Wooden pews sat under pale sheets. The air smelled of dry timber, cold stone, and old rain. Clara moved carefully, noting weak boards, water stains, and a back wall that seemed oddly thick for such a small building. Atlas did not explore the pews. He did not sniff the corners. He walked straight down the aisle to the old pulpit, sat before it, and stared at the floor. "Atlas," Clara said softly. The dog did not turn. He raised one front paw and scratched once at a narrow floorboard beneath the pulpit. Then again. Clara knelt beside him. She tapped the board with her knuckles. A hollow sound answered from below, deep and wide, not like a crawl space, not like rot, but like an empty room holding its breath. Clara Whitmore returned to St. Alder Chapel the next morning with a thermos of black coffee, a yellow legal pad, and no illusion that the old building had become kinder overnight. The sun over Briarhaven was bright but gentle, pouring across St. Alder Lake until the water looked like blue glass under a thin veil of silver. A few gulls drifted above the reeds. Down the road, the town bakery had already opened, sending the smell of cinnamon and warm apples into the clean northern air. It was the kind of morning that made troubles look smaller from a distance. But Clara knew better. Some troubles only waited until a person stepped closer. Atlas jumped from the back of the vehicle before she could call him. The 5-year-old German shepherd stood in the grass, his sable coat catching bits of gold in the sunlight, his ears high, his body still. He did not look at the lake. He did not look at the road. He looked at the chapel doors as though something inside had been awake all night, waiting for him to return. Clara watched him and felt that familiar tug between reason and instinct. The badge on her belt trusted procedure. The woman inside her trusted Atlas. A pickup truck rolled slowly up the gravel drive, coughing once before it stopped beside the chapel. Out stepped Owen Pike, the local maintenance man Clara had called after finding his name in the Old Town inspection notes. Owen was 58, lean as a fence rail, with weathered skin, pale blue eyes, and a short gray beard that looked trimmed by habit rather than vanity. He wore a faded green flannel shirt, heavy work pants, and boots dusted with sawdust. His left shoulder dipped slightly when he walked, the result, he later said, of falling through a rotten barn loft 20 years earlier and learning humility from the floor. Owen had the quiet manner of a man who trusted tools more than speeches. "You're Daniel Whitmore's girl," Owen said, not as a question. Clara turned from the chapel. "You knew my father?" Owen removed his cap with both hands. His hair was silver and thin, pressed flat from the brim. Knew him enough to know he measured twice, prayed once, and still blamed himself if the wood complained. Good man, gentle with old things. He glanced at St. Alder Chapel, and his mouth tightened. This place was one of his favorites before the trouble came. The words touched Clara softly but deeply. She had spent years hearing her father described in official terms: disgraced restorer, disputed expert, unreliable witness. Owen's plain sentence felt like sunlight on a photograph kept too long in a drawer. They entered the chapel together. Morning light fell through the broken stained glass in uneven colors, blue on the pews, red across the aisle, gold over the old pulpit where Atlas had scratched the floor the day before. Owen moved slowly, tapping boards with the handle of a small hammer, studying wall seams, leaning close to air vents. He did not chatter. When he finally spoke, Clara listened. "This back wall is wrong," he said, standing behind the pulpit. "Too thick for a chapel this size, and that vent line there, it runs up toward the bell tower, but it doesn't serve the main room. I was hired years back to keep a small dehumidifier system running under the floor. Everett said it protected old hymnals and stained glass panels. I never saw more than the service hatch he allowed me to see." "Did you ever suspect another space?" Owen looked at her with a tired half-smile. "Agent Whitmore, in old Vermont buildings, there's always another space. Question is whether it holds Christmas decorations, raccoon memories, or somebody's mistake." Atlas moved toward a stack of wooden crates near the robing room. They were gray with age, stamped with faded church inventory labels. Clara followed, careful not to disturb more than necessary. Atlas sniffed along one crate, paused, then gave a low breath through his nose. Not a bark, not alarm, a signal. Clara crouched and read the label. Christmas Hymnals, 1987. She lifted the lid. On top lay old hymn books, their covers softened by time, pages smelling of dust and paper. Beneath them, tucked along the corner seam, was a fine red powder, too bright and too mineral to belong to Vermont pine or chapel plaster. A single red grain slid from the crate and struck the wooden floor with a sound Clara should not have heard, yet somehow did. Tiny, dry, sharp. The chapel seemed to pause around it, as if even the dust had stopped drifting to see whether Clara would understand. She did not touch it with her fingers. She photographed it, marked the crate, and used a small evidence envelope from her field kit to collect a sample. Her mind moved through old case briefings, decorative panels, plaster replicas, contemporary craft items, religious restoration material, innocent words used as coats for stolen history. She had seen enough smuggling reports to know criminals rarely hid beautiful things under ugly names by accident. Clara stepped outside to make a call where the signal was stronger. Atlas stayed at the doorway, watching her through the gap like a sentry with fur. Agent Miles Rourke answered on the third ring from New York. Miles was 42, broad-faced, dark-skinned, and always sounded as though he had 3 cold coffees on his desk and 4 thoughts ahead of everyone else. He wore round glasses that made him look scholarly until he smiled, which he often did at precisely the wrong moments. Miles had grown up the son of a museum guard in Queens, spending childhood Saturdays under marble staircases and learning that quiet rooms could hold very noisy lies. In the FBI's art crime unit, he was the man people called when a shipping invoice looked too clean. "Tell me you're calling about maple syrup and not a federal headache," Miles said. "Everett Vale," Clara replied. "Run the name against old cultural property files. Also, Lydia Vale and Marcus Bellamy." Miles exhaled. "That is not maple syrup." While he searched, Clara looked back at the chapel. The whiteboards, the leaning tower, the lake beyond it, everything seemed too peaceful for the unease rising in her chest. Minutes passed. Then Miles returned, his voice lower. "Everett Vale appears in several peripheral files. Nothing that led to charges. Old acquisitions, questionable provenance, sealed interviews, a few references tied to South Asian and Southeast Asian objects. Lydia Vale's gallery appears in documentation reviews. Marcus Bellamy's storage company shows up in shipping records. And Clara?" She tightened her grip on the phone. "Say it." "There are missing references connected to Daniel Whitmore, not full files, more like shadows where files used to be." For a moment, the lake wind felt colder. Clara thanked him and ended the call, but she did not move right away. Her father's name had become a locked room in her heart. Now, in a forgotten chapel beside a bright northern lake, she could hear something turning behind that door. Inside, Atlas had moved to the stained glass panel behind the pulpit. The panel showed a shepherd holding a lost lamb against his chest. Much of the glass was old, uneven, and softly colored, but the lower frame had been repaired with newer metal. Clara ran her eyes along the base, then studied the floor, wall, and pulpit alignment. Her father had taught her that buildings told the truth in measurements even when people did not. She took out a laser measure from her kit. From the inner wall to the pulpit, wrong. From the back exterior line to the visible interior depth, wrong again. Owen helped her confirm it with a tape measure, his brows drawing closer with every number. "There's space missing," Clara said. Owen nodded slowly. "More than a closet, less than a miracle, though in Vermont we try not to rule those out before lunch." Clara almost smiled. "Almost." Atlas lowered his head and nosed at a narrow strip beneath the pulpit base. Clara knelt and found a tiny iron plate hidden under old wax and dust. At first glance, it looked like a nail scar, but when she cleaned it gently with the edge of a cloth, a keyhole appeared, small and dark. She took out the iron key from Everett's folder. It had not fit the front door. It had not fit the robing room. It had not fit the service hatch, Owen remembered. But as Clara brought it toward the hidden lock, Atlas pressed close to her shoulder, his body tense, his breath steady and warm. The key slid in perfectly. Clara looked once at Owen, then at Atlas, then at the shepherd in the stained glass above them. She turned the key. Deep beneath St. Alder Chapel, something heavy shifted with a long mechanical groan, like an old door waking from a sleep no one had dared disturb. The hidden mechanism beneath St. Alder Chapel did not open with drama. It opened with patience. First came the deep groan Clara had heard through the floorboards, then a slow metal sigh, then a narrow seam appeared at the base of the pulpit where no seam had been a moment before. Dust trembled along the old wood like gray snow. Owen Pike took one step back, his weathered face losing color beneath the brim of his cap. Atlas remained beside Clara, still as a carved guardian, his dark sable coat rising slightly along the shoulders, his brown eyes fixed on the widening gap. Clara did not rush forward. The part of her that was Daniel Whitmore's daughter wanted to know what secret had been sleeping under the chapel. The part of her that wore a badge knew secrets could become evidence the moment a human hand disturbed them. She lifted her body camera, switched it on, and spoke clearly into the small device. Time, 9:47 a.m. Location, St. Alder Chapel, Briarhaven, Vermont. Hidden entry discovered beneath pulpit area during property inspection. Possible concealed structure, entering only for initial safety assessment. No items to be handled unless necessary for safety. Her voice sounded steady. Her pulse did not. Owen swallowed. "You want me to call someone?" "Not yet," Clara said. "Stay at the top. Do not step past the threshold unless I ask. If I say leave, you leave." Owen gave one stiff nod. He was a man who had spent his life repairing barns, chapels, and old homes, but even he seemed to understand that this was not ordinary rot or ordinary repair. Atlas looked up at Clara once. His ears tilted forward. She clipped a short lead to his collar, not because he needed control, but because procedure gave fear something useful to hold. The opening revealed concrete stairs descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was not damp. It was cold, dry, and faintly metallic, carrying the smell of machine oil, old paper, and treated wood. Clara switched on her flashlight. The beam fell over smooth concrete walls, rubber treads, and a steel handrail with no rust. Above them was a chapel with peeling paint and a sagging roof. Below was work done by someone with money, secrecy, and time. They descended slowly. At the bottom, a motion sensor clicked. A strip of industrial lights flickered once, twice, then came alive in a pale sequence that ran across the ceiling like a quiet sunrise under the earth. Owen whispered something from above, not quite a prayer and not quite a construction estimate. Clara stopped on the final step. The space below St. Alder Chapel was not a cellar. It was a preservation chamber. Long steel shelves stood in neat rows on vibration-dampening pads. Climate control units hummed softly along the walls. Dehumidifiers blinked with dim green lights, older models, but well-maintained. Wooden crates sat stacked by code rather than by chance, each marked with numbers, letters, and plain labels that tried very hard to sound boring. Church panels, stone garden replica, devotional plaster copy, textile fragments. Along the far side, tall cabinets held wrapped objects under acid-free cloth. Several glass-fronted cases contained smaller pieces on foam supports. There were filing boxes, restoration lamps, sealed tubes, rolls of photography paper, and a work table at the center with a banker's lamp gone cold. For one heartbeat, the beauty of it struck Clara before the meaning did. A bronze figure no taller than her forearm rested under soft fabric, one hand raised in blessing. A red stone relief leaned in a padded cradle, its carved lines delicate as lace. A row of ceramic vessels sat on custom mounts, each one quiet and solemn, each one looking less like property than memory. Near the back wall stood several objects that were clearly replicas, too clean, too perfect, too recently made. They waited beside older things like masks beside living faces. A low chime trembled through the chamber, though no bell had moved. Clara froze. The sound was thin, silver, and mournful, as if the chapel above had breathed through some hidden pipe and awakened one tiny note below. Atlas lifted his head toward the sound, then turned, not toward danger, but toward a glass case in the corner where something small waited in the light. Inside the low case sat a stone dog no larger than a loaf of bread. Its body was worn smooth by age, its ears rounded by time, and around its neck had been carved a tiny collar with a bell. The figure was not grand like the bronze statues or valuable in the obvious way diamonds were valuable, yet Atlas approached it with a tenderness that made Clara's throat tighten. He lowered his head until his nose hovered above the glass. Then he released a soft, trembling whine, the same sound he had made over Everett's iron key. A modern working dog stood before an ancient guardian, and for a moment the room seemed to belong to both of them. Clara photographed the case, the surrounding shelves, the labels, the airflow units, the entry stairs. Then discipline returned like a hand on her shoulder. She backed away, keeping Atlas with her. She had seen enough. This was not hidden family storage. This was potential evidence in a cultural property crime possibly larger than anything a local probate office had imagined. She climbed back to the chapel floor and called her supervisor. Assistant Special Agent in Charge, Miriam Calder, answered with the clipped calm of someone who had spent 25 years hearing bad news before lunch. Calder was 54, tall, broad-framed, with dark brown skin, close-cropped black hair threaded with silver, and eyes that could quiet a room without raising her voice. Years in financial crimes and art theft had given her a habit of patience that felt almost merciful until someone lied to her. Clara explained the hidden chamber, the coded crates, the apparent antiquities, and her conflict as the legal recipient of the property. Calder did not interrupt. When Clara finished, she said, "Step away from the chamber. Secure the entry. Nobody touches anything. I am sending Art Crime, HSI, and a forensic team. You remain as discovering agent and reporting witness until we establish roles. Understood?" "Understood," Clara said. By late afternoon, the quiet chapel had become a careful hive of federal movement. Vehicles parked behind a line of maples to avoid drawing half the town. Evidence technicians laid protective pathways. HSY, Special Agent Priya Nandakumar, arrived first, a compact woman in her late 30s with deep brown eyes, black hair braided tight down her back, and the precise, gentle hands of someone who respected fragile things. She spoke softly to everyone, but her questions landed like nails. With her came forensic specialist Jonah Reed, a pale, sandy-haired man of 35 with a trimmed red beard, square glasses, and the dry humor of a person who trusted labels more than people. Jonah carried cases, lights, gloves, and a portable scanner as if arriving for surgery. They entered the chamber in stages. Each item was photographed before anyone moved near it. Priya examined the red stone dust Clara had collected and glanced toward the wrapped reliefs. Jonah checked the camera system and found the primary recorder missing from its mount. "Removed cleanly," he said. Someone knew where it was. In the center of the chamber, Priya found the envelope. It lay on the old writing table beneath the banker's lamp, cream-colored, sealed in wax, with Clara's name written in a thin, slanting hand. No one let Clara touch it until Jonah photographed it from every side, bagged it, logged it, and opened it under camera view. Inside was Everett Vale's letter. Miriam Calder read it aloud over speaker from the field office after receiving the scan. Everett's words came through flat and official in Calder's voice, but Clara heard the old man beneath them all the same. He admitted that he had once profited from a world where beautiful objects arrived with ugly silences attached. He had looked away when labels were too neat, when ownership histories began conveniently before 1970, when sacred things crossed oceans dressed as decor. In his later years, Lydia Vale and Marcus Bellamy had used St. Alder Chapel as a hidden way station. Everett had gathered proof, but had not found the courage, or perhaps the innocence, to stand in public with it. Then came the lines that made Clara's chest ache. He wrote that Daniel Whitmore had refused to authenticate a piece whose story had been manufactured. For that refusal, Daniel had been blamed, cornered, and quietly erased from the professional circles that once praised him. Everett had done too little then. St. Alder Chapel, the Iron Key, and the records below were his late and imperfect attempt to make one honest hand reach what his own dishonest years had helped bury. Clara stood very still. Atlas leaned against her leg, warm and solid. She did not cry. Not there. Not with cameras running and evidence tags blooming around her like little white flags. But some small, frozen part of her father's memory shifted inside her as if it had finally been allowed to sit down. Near the old organ, Atlas suddenly pulled away. Not hard, just certain. He moved to the instrument's side panel, sniffed a narrow service seam, then sat. Jonah removed the panel after photographing it. Behind the pipes was a compact backup recorder wrapped in black cloth and taped behind a wooden support. Everett liked insurance, Jonah murmured. The recovered footage was grainy, but clear enough. It showed Lydia Vale entering through a service section Clara had not yet seen, elegant even in a dark coat. Marcus Bellamy followed with 2 workers, directing them toward a side chamber. They removed several crates, replaced 2 objects with replicas, and disabled the main recorder before leaving. Marcus paused once near a red stone figure and wrapped it in protective cloth with the care of a man who knew its worth. Clara leaned closer as Jonah enlarged the frame. Marcus was holding the red stone piece against his chest. Behind him sat a crate with a printed label, Contemporary Garden Replica. Value $240. The words were so plain, they felt almost insulting. Clara looked from the screen to the chamber around her, to the ancient objects waiting under cloth, to Atlas still sitting beside the old stone dog. This was no longer an inheritance problem. It was no longer Everett Vale's final joke. St. Alder Chapel was a hidden artery in something larger, a quiet northern doorway through which stolen history had been made to disappear. St. Alder Chapel was no longer a forgotten chapel by the lake. By sunrise, it had become a sealed federal scene wrapped in yellow tape, guarded by quiet agents, and watched from a distance by curious townspeople pretending not to stare. The bright Vermont morning made the whole thing feel stranger. Birds still moved through the birch trees. The bakery still opened on Main Street. The lake still shone like polished blue glass. Yet beneath the old pulpit, history sat in evidence bags and climate-controlled silence, waiting for someone to tell the truth. Clara Whitmore stood outside the chapel with Atlas at her side, while Assistant Special Agent in Charge Miriam Calder reviewed the next steps. Clara had already signed the conflict memo. St. Alder Chapel might have been left to her in Everett Vale's will, but every decision involving the hidden chamber now belonged to the interagency team. Clara would remain involved as the discovering agent, as a trained art crime investigator, and as the daughter of a man whose name had appeared in the missing shadows of the old files. That last part was not official, but everyone could feel it. Some wounds do not need paperwork to be real. Miriam Calder looked across the grass toward the chapel doors. Her close-cropped, silver-threaded hair caught the wind, and her expression remained calm in that immovable way Clara had always respected. "You follow the evidence," Calder said. Not your grief, not Everett's letter, not Lydia's smile. Evidence. Clara nodded. Understood. Atlas leaned lightly against her leg, as if agreeing on behalf of all creatures who did not trust elegant smiles. By noon, the evidence had begun to form a road. Jonah Reed catalogued the crate codes from the hidden chamber. Priya Nandakumar compared residue from the red stone dust to the wrapped reliefs. Miles Rourke, working from New York, traced shipping invoices connected to Marcus Bellamy's storage network. The same pattern surfaced again and again: vague labels, low declared values, restoration language, private collection claims, and one strange spelling error repeated across 3 different certificates. The word provenance had been misspelled as provenance in the same careful typeface, like a fingerprint made of arrogance. The road led to Manhattan, to Bellamy and Vale Antiquities. The gallery sat on a narrow, expensive street where the windows were tall, the sidewalks were clean, and even the delivery men seemed to lower their voices. Inside, white walls glowed beneath soft lights. Glass cases held small bronzes, stone fragments, lacquered boxes, and objects described by silver plaques in language polished smooth by lawyers. Waiters moved with trays of sparkling water and pale wine. Wealthy collectors drifted from piece to piece, nodding thoughtfully, as if wisdom could be purchased with the right frame and a tasteful receipt. Lydia Vale stood near the center of the room, wearing a dove-gray silk dress and pearls that looked almost humble, until one noticed how perfectly they matched everything else. Her pale blonde hair was pinned in a smooth twist, and her face carried the gentle sorrow of a woman who had practiced sympathy in mirrors. She greeted donors as if she were welcoming them into a church. Marcus Bellamy stood by the rear archway, broad-shouldered and silver-bearded, in a dark-tailored suit, laughing softly with a banker from Boston. His charm was quiet, expensive, and carefully rationed. He looked like a man who believed all doors opened for him because most of them always had. Clara did not enter as a lone hero playing at disguise. The operation had been approved, supervised, and layered. A confidential buyer had requested documentation review for several pieces. An insurance compliance appointment gave the team a reason to examine storage procedures. Clara attended as part of the Federal Review team, her badge not yet shown to the room, Atlas cleared as a working K-9 under a narrow operational purpose. The leash in Clara's hand was short. Her patience was shorter, though no one could see it. Atlas behaved beautifully. He sat when Clara stopped, moved when she moved, and looked at a nervous junior associate with such solemn kindness that the young man nearly apologized to the dog for existing. A woman in emerald earrings whispered that the German shepherd seemed rather intense. Clara murmured, "He takes art seriously." The woman laughed, and the tension around them softened by one small human degree. Then Atlas stopped in front of a closed white door, and the soft gallery air changed. His nose lifted, his ears sharpened. A faint chemical sweetness drifted from the seam beneath the door, mixed with treated wood and old mineral dust. Clara felt the room's quiet music continue behind her, but for one breath, all she heard was Atlas breathing. The door led to a private restoration room. Lydia appeared beside Clara before Clara could ask the junior associate for access. "That area is not part of the public presentation," Lydia said lightly. "No," Clara replied, "it is part of the documentation review." Lydia's smile held, but something behind it cooled. "Of course, we are always happy to support transparency." The restoration room was spotless at first glance. Stainless tables, magnifying lamps, storage drawers, cotton gloves, and soft brushes arranged with almost theatrical neatness. But Atlas moved to a cabinet near the back wall and sat. Priya, who had entered with the compliance team, photographed the cabinet labels. Inside were folders of before and after images. A red stone fragment appeared in one photo, still coated with earth. In another, the same piece sat clean, mounted and described as belonging to a pre-1970 European private collection. Clara's jaw tightened. Miles called while they were still inside. "I found your typo," he said. "Same misspelling from the chapel paperwork appears in a certificate tied to a piece Bellamy and Vale offered last spring. Same font, same spacing. Whoever made these documents got lazy or confident." "Both," Clara said. When she stepped back into the gallery, Lydia was waiting. "Your father was a careful man," Lydia said softly, close enough that only Clara could hear. "Too careful, perhaps. In this world, people who insist on perfect truth often find themselves very lonely." Clara met her eyes. For a moment the old pain rose like cold water. Daniel Whitmore in his workshop, Daniel cleaning glass with hands that trembled near the end, Daniel saying some doors closed because a person refused to bow. Clara wanted to answer as a daughter. Instead, she answered as an agent. Lonely is not the same as wrong. Lydia's expression did not change, but her fingers tightened once around the stem of her glass. The team completed the surface review without forcing the deeper move too soon. Calder's instruction had been clear. Gather enough to reach the next storage layer. Do not frighten the birds before finding the nest. Marcus remained pleasant, but he watched Atlas more than he watched Clara. That told her plenty. Men like Marcus did not fear dogs unless dogs had noticed something people missed. Near the rear exit, Atlas tugged once, not hard, just certain. Clara followed him into the service hall and then to the alley behind the gallery. A white delivery truck idled there, its side painted with curling green letters. Fine floral installations. A young driver in a black cap leaned against the door, scrolling on his phone, pretending badly not to listen to the voices from inside. Atlas stood beside the truck and stared at the cargo doors. Clara moved close enough to see through a narrow gap where the latch had not fully caught. Inside, behind a row of tall flower crates, sat a wooden shipping box marked with the small silver bird emblem she had seen on Everett Vale's private crate codes. A clipboard hung from the rear handle. The top sheet read, "Decorative Church Panels." Priya came up beside Clara, saw the label, and said nothing. Atlas looked from the truck to Clara, his brown eyes steady and grave. Clara did not order the truck stopped. Not yet. The chapel had given them a hidden chamber. The gallery had given them the paperwork. This truck might give them the larger nest. She stepped back, signaled the surveillance team, and let the white vehicle roll into Manhattan traffic, carrying its quiet lie toward wherever the truth had been waiting. The white delivery truck left Manhattan wearing its innocent little lie in green letters. Fine floral installations. It rolled through traffic with the patience of a Sunday florist, then crossed into Queens as the afternoon light turned flat and silver over the warehouses. 3 unmarked vehicles followed at a distance, never too close, never too eager. Clara Whitmore sat in the second car with Atlas beside her, the German shepherd's sable head resting low between the seats, his ears twitching at every horn, brake hiss, and change in engine rhythm. He did not understand subpoenas or surveillance warrants, but he understood pursuit. He understood that something taken from the quiet dark beneath St. Alder Chapel was moving farther from home. Assistant Special Agent in Charge, Miriam Calder, coordinated from a mobile command vehicle 2 blocks back. HSI Agent Priya Nandakumar rode with the evidence unit, her braid tucked beneath a dark cap, her soft voice giving precise updates over the radio. Jonah Reed had already cross-referenced the silver bird crate mark with the hidden chamber inventory. Miles Rourke, still in New York, sent message after message as he traced companies that seemed to exist only on invoices, wire transfers, and carefully worded shipping declarations. Every clean document had begun to look dirty in the same way. The truck finally turned into a narrow industrial lane in Queens, where old brick buildings stood shoulder to shoulder under faded signs. The warehouse it entered looked almost disappointingly ordinary. A gray, roll-up door, a small office window with dusty blinds, a sign reading Bellamy Logistics Conservation Services, the kind of name designed to put inspectors to sleep. There were no guards at the entrance, no dramatic gates, no gleaming security office. That was the trick of it. If St. Alder Chapel had hidden behind holiness and neglect, this place hid behind paperwork and boredom. Clara watched from across the street as the truck backed inside. "No visible security," she said quietly. Priya's voice answered over comms. "Visible security makes neighbors curious. This network seems allergic to curiosity." They did not enter immediately. The team had been careful since the chapel. The backup recorder, the matching crate marks, the repeated certificate typo, and the gallery documentation gave them enough for surveillance and a broader warrant request. But Calder wanted one more layer. Active handling. Proof that Lydia Vale and Marcus Bellamy still controlled the movement of the objects, not merely the history of old transactions. So the team waited. They let the warehouse breathe. They let the people inside believe the day belonged to them. By early evening, a controlled notification went out through a channel Marcus's company was known to monitor. St. Alder Chapel would undergo full federal inventory the next morning. It was not exactly false. It was simply placed where anxious eyes would find it. Greed, Clara had learned, often traveled faster than guilt. Inside the surveillance van, a young technical analyst named Denise Park monitored warehouse feeds pulled from nearby street cameras. Denise was 29, small-framed, with straight black hair cut blunt at her chin and silver-rimmed glasses that slid down her nose whenever she concentrated. She had the dry humor of someone who lived on vending machine pretzels and impossible deadlines. "We have movement," she said, tapping one screen. "Rear entrance, 2 vehicles, 1 black sedan, 1 blue cargo van." Clara leaned closer. The sedan door opened first. Lydia Vale stepped out in a dark wool coat, pearls visible even in poor light, her pale hair pinned with the same calm perfection she had worn in the gallery. Marcus followed from the van, broad shoulders tense, gray beard catching the warehouse light. He spoke sharply to 2 workers, pointing toward the loading bay with the authority of a man accustomed to moving priceless things as if they were office chairs. A strip of fluorescent light inside the warehouse flickered hard, then steadied, and for half a second the open bay flashed white around Marcus's hands. Clara saw the edge of red stone beneath a folded cloth. Then the door rolled down, and the street fell quiet again. Calder's voice came through. "We have active handling. Warrant is signed. Move." The entry was clean and disciplined. No chaos, no grand speech. Just federal agents moving with purpose through the front and rear doors as the warehouse lights hummed above them. Clara entered with Atlas on lead. The first smell was cardboard and machine oil. Beneath that came the colder scents Atlas had known from St. Alder: treated wood, preservation cloth, mineral dust, and the faint chemical sweetness from the gallery restoration room. The warehouse interior was larger than it appeared from the street. Long tables held lamps, magnifiers, soft brushes, and padded blocks. A scanner sat beside stacks of old photographs. Shelves carried crates with labels so bland they almost smiled. Decorative church panels, modern devotional replica, garden stone fragment, textile display sample. Along one wall stood newly made copies, too perfect and too lifeless, waiting to stand in for older objects that had traveled far without permission. Atlas moved slowly down the central aisle. He ignored half the crates. He paused at one, sniffed, then moved on. At the third row, he sat before a box marked CH-17. Clara checked the list Jonah had sent. CH-17 appeared in Everett's hidden chamber footage. Inside, under protective wrapping, Priya found a red stone figure whose carved surface matched the dust from the hymn crate. Atlas then led them to 2 more boxes, one containing a stone relief removed from its mounting frame, another filled not with an object, but with folders, old photographs, and labels not yet attached to their lies. Jonah opened one folder under camera view. Before photos, he said. Same relief, still carrying soil traces. Then, after photos. Cleaned, mounted, and assigned to a European private collection before 1970. He lifted another page. And there's our typo again. Provenance. Miles spoke through the speakerphone, voice sharp with grim satisfaction. Same template used in at least 6 sales inquiries, 1 buyer list attached, museums, private collectors, 2 offshore accounts. Clara looked across the warehouse at Lydia and Marcus, now separated by agents. Lydia's face had lost none of its beauty, but the softness was gone. Without it, she looked less like a patron of culture and more like a winter window. Marcus still tried to keep his voice reasonable. "You're making a mistake," he said. "These are conservation materials. Many are replicas." "Some are," Clara replied. That was the point. Lydia turned toward her. "Everett built this. Everett stored them. Everett lied to everyone." "He did," Clara said, and the honesty in her own answer seemed to surprise Lydia. "He looked away for too many years. He let beautiful things pass through ugly hands. But you kept the machine running. You cleaned the papers. You moved the crates. You sold stories you knew were false." Marcus's jaw tightened beneath his neat gray beard. "We preserved objects that would have disappeared." Clara looked at the red stone figure resting in Priya's careful hands. Heritage does not need to be taken from its home in order to be saved. For the first time, Marcus had no polished answer. Near the rear workbench, Atlas suddenly lowered his head and nudged a metal drawer with his nose. Jonah opened it after photographing the latch. Inside was an old cassette tape in a brittle plastic case labeled D. Whitmore, Statement Draft. Clara's breath caught before she could stop it. Calder gave permission for a field playback after the tape was logged and digitized through Jonah's portable unit. The voice that emerged was faint, scratched by age, but Clara knew it before the first full sentence ended. Daniel Whitmore. Her father's voice was gentle, tired, and firm. He spoke of an object he had refused to authenticate, of paperwork that felt too clean, of pressure from people who wanted his signature more than his judgment. Then he said, "An artifact is not merely a beautiful thing. It is a prayer, a memory, and the work of hands no longer here to defend it. If we lie about where it came from, we do not preserve it. We only teach it to be silent." Clara stood among crates, agents, replicas, and old sins, and felt the long shadow over her father's name begin to lift. Not completely, not magically, but enough for light to enter. Atlas moved once more, this time beneath a low storage shelf. He pawed gently at something small. Clara crouched and found a tiny metal bell, dull with age, its shape nearly identical to the carved bell on the stone dog beneath St. Alder Chapel. She lifted it carefully with gloved fingers. It rang once. The sound was small, clear, and impossibly tender in the cold warehouse air, as if something long carried away had remembered the road home. By the time spring returned to Briarhaven, St. Alder Chapel no longer looked like a place the world had forgotten. The snow had retreated into the shaded edges of the woods, leaving the grass bright and soft around the lake. Birch trees lifted new green leaves into the clean northern light. The old chapel still wore its scars, but now they seemed less like shame and more like testimony. The roof had been braced, the front doors had been repaired. The bell tower stood straighter against the blue Vermont sky, as if the building itself had remembered how to breathe. For months the chapel had remained sealed, catalogued, guarded, and studied. Federal agents had come and gone. Conservators had measured humidity, examined crates, and moved through the hidden chamber with the care of nurses in a room full of sleeping elders. Clara Whitmore did not claim the objects as her own. She never even allowed herself to think of them that way. Everett Vale had left her a deed, yes, but the chamber below St. Alder held more than property. It held prayers carved in stone, hands shaped in bronze, fragments of communities that had never agreed to be turned into investments. The court process moved slowly, as all serious things do when the truth has to be handled without breaking it. St. Alder Chapel was placed under a non-profit trust overseen by the court, federal authorities, local preservation leaders, and representatives from countries connected to the recovered objects. The arrangement was not glamorous, but Clara liked that. Glamour had caused enough trouble. This work needed patience, humility, and very good filing cabinets. One of the trust advisors was Dr. Ananya Rao, a cultural heritage scholar in her late 60s who arrived from Chennai with silver hair braided down her back, warm brown skin, and eyes that carried both grief and discipline. She was small in stature but carried herself like a temple column, straight, quiet, and impossible to ignore. When she first entered the hidden chamber, she did not speak for several minutes. She stood before the red stone figure recovered from the Queen's warehouse, pressed her palms together, and bowed her head. Clara stood nearby with Atlas, saying nothing. For once, silence was the most respectful language in the room. Later, Dr. Rao gave Clara a handwritten letter on cream paper. "This is not a thank you for treasure," she said in careful English, her voice low and steady. Treasure is a word collectors use when they wish to forget where something came from. This is a thank you for returning memory to the road home. Clara read the letter that evening on the chapel steps, while St. Alder Lake turned gold in the setting sun. Dr. Rao wrote of villages, shrines, lost records, and old photographs kept by families who still remembered what had been missing. She wrote that justice for cultural heritage was rarely loud. Often it sounded like a crate being opened correctly, a label being changed honestly, a long journey finally pointed in the right direction. Clara folded the letter and held it in both hands for a long time. Her father would have understood every word. Lydia Vale and Marcus Bellamy did not vanish into some neat ending. Real life was not that generous or that tidy. Their gallery closed under the weight of investigation. Assets were frozen. Collectors stopped answering calls. Museums that had once praised their taste began reviewing old acquisitions with nervous thoroughness. Their trial still waited somewhere down the legal road, but their polished empire had already cracked in public view. The world that had once admired them now examined every certificate, every invoice, every graceful lie. Owen Pike returned to work on the chapel roof in April, moving carefully along the scaffolding in his faded flannel and patched work jacket. At 58, he still climbed ladders with the grumbling dignity of a man who believed every board deserved a second chance, but no ladder deserved trust. He repaired the old floor, reinforced the pulpit, and rebuilt the lower frame around the stained glass shepherd. When he offered to replace the cracked piece of blue glass near the lamb's ear, Clara asked him to leave it. Owen looked down from the ladder. "You sure? I can make it near perfect." "Leave the crack," Clara said. He studied her face, then nodded. "Your father would have liked that." The words came gently, but they struck deep. Clara looked at the shepherd in the window, at the lamb held close, at the thin blue fracture that now caught the light in a bright crooked line. "Things that were broken do not have to pretend they were never broken," she said. "They only need to learn how to hold light in a new shape." Just then a spring wind slipped through the open chapel door, and the tiny bell Clara had hung near the entry gave one clear note. Atlas raised his head. Every person in the room paused. The sound was small, but it moved through the chapel like a blessing that had lost its way long ago and finally found the right address. The St. Alder Heritage Education and Restoration Trust opened to the local community on a mild Saturday afternoon. It was not a museum in the grand sense. There were no sacred objects placed behind glass for entertainment, no sensitive artifacts displayed to impress wealthy visitors. Instead, the upper chapel held photographs, timelines, teaching panels, and stories about how provenance could be forged, how labels could hide harm, and how ordinary people could help protect cultural memory. One corner honored conservators and researchers who had refused to bend the truth, including Daniel Whitmore. Clara had approved the wording herself, then stood alone before the panel for several minutes, with Atlas pressed against her knee. People from Briarhaven came with flowers, coffee, apple bread, and the gentle curiosity of a town that had watched a forgotten chapel become a doorway to the wider world. Mrs. Elsie Kettering, an 81-year-old widow with soft white curls, rosy cheeks, and the fearless cheer of a woman who had outlived 3 snowstorms, 2 hip surgeries, and 1 very difficult husband, presented Atlas with a dark blue neckerchief embroidered in yellow thread. St. Alder's shepherd. Atlas sat with grave importance as Clara tied it around his neck. He looked noble enough for a statue until Mrs. Kettering dropped half a butter cookie onto the floor. Then he looked at Clara with the solemn hope of a saint negotiating one small earthly exception. "Fine," Clara whispered. 1. Atlas accepted the cookie with the restraint of a gentleman and the speed of a thief. Several elderly visitors laughed, and for the first time in a long while, Clara laughed with them without feeling guilty for it. Near sunset, after the last visitors had gone and Owen had locked the tool shed, Clara walked through the restored chapel one final time for the evening. The educational panels stood quiet. The stained glass painted soft colors over the floor. Beneath her feet, the hidden chamber no longer felt like a secret. It felt like a promise being kept carefully, step by step, until every rightful return could be made. She thought of Everett Vale, flawed and clever, too late in his regret, but not too late to leave a path. She thought of Lydia and Marcus, who had mistaken possession for honor. She thought of her father, whose truth had waited years for someone to hear it clearly. And she thought of Atlas, the dog who had followed a scent beneath an old pulpit and found not treasure, but testimony. Clara locked the chapel doors as the sun lowered over St. Alder Lake. Atlas stood beside her, ears turned toward the building, the blue neckerchief moving softly in the breeze. The small bell rang once more from inside. For a moment, Clara felt they were not guarding wealth at all. They were guarding the small, patient souls of history until each one could be called home. At the end of this story, we are reminded that not every treasure is made of gold, and not every miracle arrives with a loud sign from heaven. Sometimes it comes through a quiet door opening at the right moment, an old truth finally being heard, or a faithful dog placing his paw where human eyes forgot to look. Clara thought she had inherited a burden. What she truly received was a chance to restore what had been hidden, to honor her father's name, and to help lost pieces of history find their way home. Atlas, with his loyal heart and watchful eyes, reminds us that animals often sense what people overlook. They do not measure wealth, titles, or pride. They measure trust, kindness, fear, and love. In our daily lives, we may not find a secret chamber beneath an old chapel, but we all meet broken things, forgotten people, neglected animals, wounded families, and truths that have been pushed aside for too long. The lesson is simple. Do not laugh at what looks ruined. Do not ignore what seems small. God can place purpose beneath the most weathered floorboards, and grace can shine through even the cracked places. May this story encourage us to live with softer hearts and stronger courage. Be kind to the elderly, protect the innocent, respect the past, and love the animals who walk beside us with a loyalty that feels almost heaven-sent. Sometimes God sends help through people. Sometimes He sends it through a dog with soulful eyes and a heart brave enough to lead the way. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that truth still matters, kindness still heals, and miracles still happen in quiet places. Leave a comment below and tell us about an animal who changed your life, or a moment when you felt God guiding you through the dark. And if you believe in stories of faith, courage, justice, and loyal animals, Please subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing more meaningful stories to you. May God bless you, protect your family, comfort your heart, and watch over every faithful animal who has ever loved us more than we deserved.